Salvara, the elite warrior of the Vrokan Empire, stood at the edge of the battlefield, her crimson armor gleaming under the cold artificial lights of Ganymede Prime. She'd have fought countless wars, crushed hundreds of species beneath her boots, but none had baffled her more than humanity. Their bodies were weak, their bones brittle, their technology primitive, compared to the vast empires that roamed the stars, yet they refused to die. They fought with a tenacity that bordered on insanity, pushing forward, even when logic dictated they should fall back. Their armies were smaller, their weapons inferior, yet time and time again they had held the line against forces that should have erased them from existence. It made no sense. She tightened her grip around the hilt of her plasma sword, the energy humming softly against her gauntlet. The battle had been raging for hours now, human defenses crumbling under the might of the Vrokan legions, yet something in her gut told her it was not going to be as easy as she had thought. She had seen too many warriors grow arrogant before the final strike, only to be torn down by an enemy they underestimated. She would not be one of them. The command came through her comms: advance, wipe them out, end this war once and for all. Her orders were clear, and she did not hesitate, leading her warriors through the wreckage of human defenses, her blade cutting through enemy soldiers like paper. They screamed as they fell, their bodies unable to withstand the force of the Vrokan assault, yet still they fought desperately, fiercely, as if they had nothing left to lose. But she knew better. Humans never fought because they had nothing to lose. They fought because they believed they could win. Then she saw him. Amongst the smoke and fire, a lone figure stood clad in battered armor. His helmet cracked, his body bloodied, yet he remained on his feet, gripping a human rifle in one hand, a jagged combat knife in the other. He was breathing heavily, but his stance was steady, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made something inside her pause. This was not the look of prey caught in a losing battle. This was the look of a predator who had just spotted its next kill. She stepped forward, her voice a low growl: stand down, human, your forces are broken, surrender, and your death will be swift. She had no interest in playing games. Her mission was simple: end this fight and move on to the next war. But the human merely tilted his head, wiping the blood from his brow, and then he grinned. You think this is over? His voice was rough, tired, but filled with something she could not place, something that made her pulse quicken. You have no idea what you're dealing with. A challenge, then she welcomed it. She lunged forward, her plasma sword cutting through the air, aimed for his heart. But he was fast, impossibly fast for a human. He sidestepped at the last moment, twisting his body with an agility that should not have been possible, her blade only grazing his side, drawing a deep wound. Yet he did not cry out, he did not stumble. Instead, he gritted his teeth, clenched his fist, and then something happened that froze her in place. The wound began to close before her eyes, the torn flesh knitting itself back together, the blood retreating back into his veins, muscle and skin reforming, as if time itself had reversed. It was impossible. Nothing in her experience, nothing in the Empire's records, spoke of humans being capable of this. She had fought enhanced species, she had seen cybernetic augmentations, even genetic modifications. But this was something else. This was raw, unnatural regeneration. He rolled his shoulder as if testing his newly healed skin. Then he smirked again, that same unsettling look in his eyes. Surprised, alien, you thought we were weak. For the first time in her life, Salvara felt something unfamiliar. Not rage, not determination, not even bloodlust. She felt uncertainty. She had come into this battle with the belief that humans were fragile, that they could be crushed like insects. But standing before her now was living, breathing proof that she had been wrong. And in war, being wrong was often the first step toward defeat. Salvara tightened her grip around her plasma sword, watching the human with a mixture of confusion and something else, something she was not willing to name yet. It was impossible. What she had just seen should not exist. Wounds did not heal like that. Flesh did not reknit itself in seconds. Bones did not regrow without augmentation or medical intervention. And yet here he stood, not just alive, but completely unbothered by the injury she had inflicted. Her warriors had seen it too. She could feel their unease behind her, the shifting of feet, the slight hesitation in their stance. Brokans were not afraid of battle, but they were creatures of logic. They understood the limits of biology, the rules of war, and what they had just witnessed did not fit within those rules. The human cracked his neck, rolling his shoulders like he was just warming up, his smirk never fading. "You look surprised, alien. Not used to a fair fight, are you?" Zalvara snarled, pushing down the flicker of doubt that had crept into her mind. She would not let a single anomaly shake her. This human was one fighter, one soldier among thousands. His abilities meant nothing in the grand scale of the war. She had cut down beings stronger than this before she would do so again. Without another word, she surged forward, blade flashing in a deadly arc. The human moved again, fast. But this time she was ready. She adjusted her strike, angling it just enough to catch him mid-dodge. Her blade sliced through his armor, cutting deep into his side. She felt the resistance of muscle parting under the energy edge. She pushed forward, using her weight to drive the attack home. For a moment he staggered, dropping to one knee. She stepped back, raising her blade again, ready to finish him before he could pull another impossible trick. But then he exhaled, slow, steady, his hands clenched at his side. And then it happened again. The wound was deep enough to kill any other being on this battlefield, yet it sealed itself right before her eyes, skin pulling together as if it had never been torn. His breathing evened out, and he rose to his feet like nothing had happened. "That one actually stung a little," he muttered, rolling his shoulder. "Guess I should take you a bit more seriously." Zalvara had never known fear, but in that moment she felt the stirrings of something dangerously close to it, and not fear, frustration, rage. She would not be made a fool of by a single human. She leaped forward, her strikes faster, more precise, cutting, slicing, aiming for vital points. She knew exactly how to kill a human. She had done it 1,000 times before, yet no matter how many times her blade struck, no matter how many wounds she inflicted, he kept getting back up. Her warriors whispered behind her, their voices laced with unease. They had expected an easy slaughter, yet here stood an enemy who refused to die, an enemy who smiled through the pain, who laughed as he bled, only to erase every wound like it had never happened. This was not how the battle was supposed to go. Zalvara's frustration turned into something colder, something sharper. She took a step back, eyes narrowing. As she studied him, there had to be a limit. No creature was truly immortal. Everything had a breaking point. Even the most advanced species could only regenerate so much before their bodies gave out. Perhaps she simply had not pushed him far enough yet. She would change that. She spun her blade, adjusting her stance, measuring his breathing, his movement. He was confident, too confident. She would use that against him. "Enough of your games, human. You are not invincible," she growled. "You have a limit. I will find it." He tilted his head, his grin widening. "Oh, please do. I would love to see you try." Her warriors watched in silence as she launched herself at him again, faster, more brutal than before. This time, she would not stop until he stayed down. Zalvara moved faster than the human could react, her blade cutting through the air, aimed directly at his throat. This time, she would not allow him a chance to recover. This time, she would end him before he could pull another impossible trick. But just as her blade was about to connect, his arm shot up, unnaturally fast, his hand catching her wrist with a grip like iron. She felt the force of it, shockingly strong, far beyond what any human should be capable of. She snarled, twisting her arm to break free, but his grip tightened. She saw something in his eyes now, something more than just confidence, something that sent a rare and unwelcome shiver down her spine. "You are persistent," he said, voice calm, amused. "Even I respect that, but you still do not understand what you are dealing with." Before she could react, he pulled her forward, slamming his forehead into her helmet with enough force to send her stumbling back. She regained her footing instantly, but the shock lingered. No human should have had the strength to do that, not to her, not to a Vrokon warrior. Her kind was stronger, faster, built for war, yet here he stood, grinning, completely unharmed. Her warriors hesitated. She could feel their doubt, their uncertainty. No Vrokon had ever seen a human like this before. They had studied their enemies, extensively catalogued their weaknesses, their limits, and everything about this human defied that knowledge. "Enough," she growled, shaking off the moment of hesitation. "This does not change anything. No matter what tricks you possess, you will fall today, human." He laughed, an actual laugh, one that burned in her ears like mockery. "Tricks," he repeated, tilting his head slightly. "Is that what you think this is?" Without warning, he moved, closing the distance between them faster than before. His fist lashed out. She barely dodged the first strike, but the second caught her in the side. Her armor absorbed most of the impact, but the sheer force of the blow sent her skidding backward. She gritted her teeth, refusing to acknowledge the pain, refusing to acknowledge the fact that he was getting stronger. No, that was impossible. Battles drained energy. They did not restore it, yet here he was moving faster, hitting harder, as if the fight itself was fueling him. Salvara refused to believe it, refused to accept the implications. She charged again, blade flashing in a deadly arc. She struck at his legs, his arms, his neck, any place that could disable him. But it was like fighting a storm. He dodged, twisted, countered. And when her blade did find flesh, it was meaningless. The wounds closed within seconds, his body refusing to break. The whispers of her warriors grew louder. Vrokans did not fear death, but they feared the unknown, and this human was an enigma, one that defied everything they had been taught. She needed to end this. She needed to prove to her soldiers that their enemies were still mortal, still bound by the same laws of existence. She had to break him completely, utterly. She fainted, left then, twisted low, bringing her blade in a devastating upward slash. It cut deep, severing his arm at the shoulder this time. She did not stop. She followed through with a second strike, slashing across his abdomen, spilling blood onto the battlefield. For a moment he staggered, his body torn open, his arm missing, his expression flickering with something unreadable, and then he exhaled, slow, controlled. And then he smiled. Salvara could only watch in stunned silence as it happened before her very eyes. Bones sprouted from the severed shoulder muscle, wrapping around it, tendons forming veins, threading through newly generated flesh. In mere seconds, his arm was whole again, as if it had never been lost. The deep gash in his stomach sealed itself, leaving nothing behind, not even a scar. Her warriors gasped, their confidence shattering. She felt it in the air, felt the weight of realization pressing down on all of them. This was no longer a battle. This was something else, something far worse. The human rolled his new shoulder, testing it before flexing his fingers, his grin widening, his eyes gleaming. Now that was impressive, he admitted. I almost felt that one. Salvara did not respond. For the first time in her life, she did not know what to say. Salvara refused to move, refused to speak, her mind racing as she tried to process what she had just witnessed. The battlefield around them seemed distant, muted, the sounds of war fading into the background as all attention focused on the impossible being standing before her, his regenerated arm flexing, his wounds completely erased as if they had never existed. This was not technology. This was not a cybernetic enhancement. She would have seen the scars, the mechanical seams. This was something else, something beyond anything her empire had ever encountered. The human tilted his head, studying her, his expression unreadable, and yet there was something in his eyes, something that made her stomach twist, not arrogance, not cruelty, but curiosity. He was enjoying this, the fight, the challenge, the moment of uncertainty in his opponent. It was not the sadistic pleasure of a warrior reveling in destruction, but the quiet thrill of a predator testing its prey. She tightened her grip on her plasma blade, pushing down the unfamiliar feeling threatening to creep into her mind. Fear? No, it was not fear. She was a Vrokan elite. She did not fear battle, but she understood when she was faced with something unknown, something that should not exist, something that changed the rules of war itself. You are still holding back, human, she growled, voice steadied. Despite the storm raging inside her, while you have the power to heal, to fight at impossible levels, yet you refuse to end this. His grin widened, but there was no malice in it, only amusement, and something deeper, something ancient. Because I want to see how far you will go, he said, simply, his voice calm, almost casual. I have fought many of your kind. They always believe they understand us. They always believe we are fragile until they realize too late that they were wrong. I want to see how long it takes before you accept the truth. She bared her teeth, lunging forward, her blade a blur as she struck with everything. She had no more testing, no more probing. She was done playing. She aimed for the joints, the tendons, the places that no amount of healing could undo fast enough. She was a warrior, trained to kill, trained to adapt, and she would find his limit. But he moved like liquid, flowing around her attacks, his body twisting, dodging, reacting with a speed and precision that should have been impossible for a creature without enhanced neural augments. He was learning, adapting his movements, changing with every strike, countering her patterns, reading her intent before she even committed to an attack. She snarled, frustration boiling over her movements, becoming sharper, more brutal. Her blade finally connected, slicing deep into his side, then his thigh, then his shoulder. Wounds that should have crippled him, should have slowed him down. But he did not falter, he did not weaken, he only smiled through the pain, his breath steady as his body repaired itself again and again. And then he struck. A fist slammed into her gut with the force of a cannon, sending her skidding backward, armor cracking under the sheer impact. She barely caught herself before hitting the ground, staggering, but refusing to fall. She tasted blood, a sensation she had not felt in years, her body protesting from the force of the hit. He did not press the attack. Instead, he stood there watching, waiting. That one actually hurt, she admitted, wiping blood from her lip. Good, he said, his tone still maddeningly calm. Now, you are starting to understand. She exhaled, steadying herself, her mind racing through every strategy, every possibility. There had to be a way to beat him. There had to be a limit. No being was truly indestructible. Her warriors stood frozen around them, watching, waiting. She could feel their unease, their doubt. If she faltered now, if she hesitated for even a moment, the battle would be lost, not because of strength, but because of something more dangerous, the loss of belief. If they lost faith in victory, the war would be over before the next strike was even made. She could not allow that. Lifting her blade once more, she locked eyes with the human, and for the first time she was forced to acknowledge the one truth she had refused to accept since the fight had begun. Humans were not weak, humans were not fragile. Humans were something far, far worse. Salvara's breath came slow, controlled, measured, despite the burning in her muscles, despite the sharp ache in her ribs. Where his strike had landed, she had fought countless warriors, had faced impossible odds, had carved her way through battlefields soaked in blood, but nothing had prepared her for this, nothing had prepared her for him. The human stood before her, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable, yet there was no mistaking the glint in his eyes, the glint of someone who had already won, who knew it. Even if the battle had not yet ended, it was infuriating, but more than that, it was terrifying, because she could not refute, it could not deny what her own senses were screaming at her. He could not be killed. No matter how many times she cut him, no matter how deep her blade struck, no matter how much blood he spilled, he always came back whole, untouched, undeterred. It was not just healing, it was something more, something beyond regeneration, beyond augmentation, beyond any science her empire possessed. And worst of all, he knew it. Still, she refused to fall, refused to retreat. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing doubt in her eyes. She would fight until her last breath, until her body gave out, because that was the Vrocom way, because she had to believe there was a way to stop him, because if there wasn't, then the war was already lost. Enough, she growled, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. If you think I will bow to you, if you think I will cower like some weakling, then you are mistaken. I do not care what tricks you possess, I will find your limit, and when I do, I will carve it into your flesh. The human chuckled low and amused, but there was no arrogance in it, only something worse. Curiosity. I would expect nothing less, he said. You are a warrior after all, and warriors fight until the end. He took a step forward, unhurried, unconcerned. Salvara tensed, readying herself for his next attack, but he did not strike. Instead, he simply stood there watching, waiting. So tell me, warrior, he continued, voice smooth, even calm, what will you do when you realize there is no end to this battle, when you understand that no matter how much you fight, I will always rise again? Her hands clenched around her blade, her teeth grinding together. She refused to answer, refused to acknowledge the possibility that he was right, that there was no victory to be found here. You hesitate, he noted, his gaze sharp, calculating, not because you are weak, but because you are beginning to see it. Aren't you the truth that you were never supposed to see, the truth your empire was never prepared to face? His words crawled under her skin like a poison, burrowing deep into the core of her mind. She hated the way he spoke, not like an enemy, not like a soldier, but like something older, something watching, something waiting. Enough, she snarled and lunged forward, blade flashing through the air, aiming for his throat, his chest, his heart, anywhere that could break him. But it did not matter. Every strike landed, every cut split flesh, every wound should have been fatal, should have left him gasping on the ground. But nothing changed, nothing ever changed. He stood there through it all, smiling as his body healed itself over and over again. She struck harder, faster, her vision, narrowing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Yet no matter what she did, the result was the same. She was not fighting an enemy, she was fighting inevitability. And for the first time in her life, she felt it. Not rage, not frustration, not even doubt. She felt horror. Because this was not war, this was not combat, this was something else, something unnatural, something unstoppable, and the worst part was that she knew he had not even been trying. She stumbled back, panting, her blade shaking in her grip. He still stood there, still unbroken. "Now you understand," he said softly, "but do not worry, warrior, I will give you time to accept it." And then he took another step forward. Salvora's grip on her blade tightened, her knuckles white, her body screaming at her to act, to attack, to do anything other than stand frozen. But for the first time in her life she hesitated, not because she was weak, not because she was afraid, but because she did not know what to do. Nothing had prepared her for this, nothing had trained her for an enemy that could not be killed, an enemy who did not even flinch when struck, an enemy who only got stronger as the fight dragged on. The human took another step forward, unhurried, deliberate, his eyes locked onto hers, studying her like she was the experiment, like she was the unknown element in this battle. She wanted to lash out, wanted to bury her blade in his chest until his heart stopped beating. But what was the point? She had already done that, and he had only laughed as his body stitched itself back together. Her warriors stood behind her, silent, watching, waiting for orders. But what could she tell them? What could she say when she herself did not have an answer? They were Vrokan elites, conquerors, destroyers of civilizations. That empire was built on the certainty that they were the apex, that no species could stand against them. But now here was a single human proving them wrong, with nothing more than his own existence. "You see it now, don't you?" the human said, voice calm, as if this were not a battlefield, as if he were merely having a conversation, and not standing in the middle of corpses and wreckage. She bared her teeth, refusing to acknowledge the truth his words were trying to force upon her. "I see nothing but an anomaly," she spat, "nothing but a mistake that should not exist." He smiled, that same knowing smile that made her stomach twist in ways she did not want to name. "Mistake," he echoed, tilting his head. "Is that what you tell yourself? Is that what you will tell your people when they ask what happened here?" She snarled and lunged, her blade flashing in a desperate arc. Her strikes were wild, fueled by frustration, by the need to prove that he was wrong, that he could be beaten, that this fight was not already lost. But it did not matter. He let her hit him. The blade sliced through his chest, cutting deep. Blood splattered across the ground, across her armor. But he did not fall, he did not even flinch. His expression never changed, not even as the wound sealed itself before her very eyes. Her breathing was heavy, her arms ached, her mind reeled. This is impossible, she thought, but the evidence was right in front of her. He reached up, gripping the front of his torn armor, and pulling it aside, revealing the skin beneath, flawless, unmarked. No scar, no sign that he had ever been wounded. "You still don't get it, do you?" he murmured. "Enough of your games, human," she snapped, voiced raw with frustration. "You want to prove something, then stop talking and fight." He exhaled, slow, steady, then his eyes sharpened, and for the first time she saw it, the shift in his stance, the slight change in his expression, the subtle drop of his shoulders. "Very well," he said. Then he moved. Fast, impossibly fast, faster than before. He closed the distance. In an instant, his fist slamming into her gut with the force of a meteor. She barely had time to register the pain before another strike came, then another. Her body buckled under the sheer power behind his attacks, her armor cracking, her bones groaning under the force. She tried to raise her blade, but he caught her wrist, twisting her arm and forcing her to drop it. Then he grabbed her by the throat, lifting her off the ground like she weighed nothing. Her warriors shouted, weapons raised, but he did not even look at them. His focus was solely on her. For the first time she felt small, powerless. She had fought gods before, or at least beings who claimed to be gods, but they bled just like everything else. This human did not bleed. This human did not die. And as she struggled in his grip, as his expression remained calm, almost patient, she realized something. She was not fighting a man. She was fighting something far, far worse. Salvara clawed at his wrist, her powerful limbs straining against his grip. But it was like trying to bend steel. His hand did not budge, his expression did not change. There was no rage, no cruelty in his eyes, just quiet certainty, the certainty of something that did not fear her, did not see her as a threat, did not even consider the possibility of losing. Her warriors surged forward, weapons drawn, but he barely glanced at them. His free hand shot out, catching the first attacker by the throat and hurling him aside like a ragdoll. Another came from behind, aiming a plasma spear at his spine, but he twisted his body, letting the weapon glance harmlessly off his armor before grabbing the soldier and slamming him into the ground with bone-shattering force. The remaining warriors hesitated, their formation breaking their confidence, cracking. They were Vrokan's elite warriors, conquerors of entire civilizations, but they had never faced something like this, something that could not be cut, could not be wounded, could not be stopped. "Let them go," Salvara hissed through gritted teeth. "This fight is between us." The human tilted his head, studying her. Then, without a word, he released her. She dropped to the ground, landing in a crouch, her muscles burning with exhaustion. But she forced herself to rise, forced herself to stand tall, even as her vision swam, even as every instinct screamed at her to run. He could have killed me just now, she realized, but he didn't. Why? She gritted her teeth, tightening her fists. If he wanted to play games, then she would play, but she would not cower. She was Vrokan, she would not break. "What are you?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "You are no ordinary human, no ordinary soldier, so tell me, what are you really?" He smiled, but this time it was different. There was no mockery, no amusement, only something deeper, something ancient, something vast. "We are what happens when the weak refuse to be weak," he said, voice calm, steady. "We are what happens when the universe tries to break us, and we break it instead." Salvara's mind raced, trying to make sense of his words, trying to fit them into something logical, something explainable. But there was nothing, no records, no intelligence reports, nothing in the vast history of her empire that could account for this for him. She had faced humans before, fought them, slaughtered them. She had seen them die in battle by the thousands, their bodies fragile, their bones weak. They were not gods, they were not unkillable. They were nothing more than a species struggling to survive against stronger forces. And yet here he was. No enhancements, no cybernetics, no genetic engineering, just raw, unexplainable power. "You're lying," she spat. "No species, no being can do what you do. You are an anomaly, a mistake." He stepped closer, his presence heavy like a force of nature pressing down on her. "And yet, here I stand," he said, his voice soft but unshakable. Salvara clenched her fists, fury boiling in her veins. She wanted to deny it, wanted to call him a trick, a fraud, a glitch in the universe that should not exist. But she could not, her own eyes would not let her. "Then why fight?" she demanded. "Why waste your strength here? If you are truly what you claim to be, then why are you still standing on this battlefield instead of ruling the stars?" His gaze darkened, and for the first time there was something else in his eyes, something colder, something sharper. "Because we have no interest in ruling," he said. "Because we are not conquerors, we are not slavers, we are not like you, we do not seek to dominate, we do not seek to control, we seek only one thing: survival." Salvara's breath caught her chest, tightening her mind, flashing back to every war her empire had waged, every planet they had burned, every species they had crushed beneath their boots. She had thought humanity was just another name to be added to that list, another species to fall before the might of the Vrokan Empire. But she had been wrong. They were not fighting for power, they were not fighting for conquest, they were fighting because they refused to be erased, because no matter how many times the universe tried to break them, they would not stay broken. They would rise again and again. Salvara stood motionless, her breath steady, but her mind a storm. Her instincts screamed at her to keep fighting, to prove that she could break him, but deep down in the part of her that no Vrokan warrior would ever admit existed, she knew the truth. She had already lost. It was not just his strength, not just his impossible regeneration, it was something deeper, something woven into his very existence. Defiance. True defiance, not the kind that came from arrogance or delusions of power, but the kind that came from something older than war, older than conquest, older than empires. She'd have fought countless enemies, had crushed them beneath the weight of her strength, her skill, her unyielding will. But this human was different. He did not fight like the others, did not seek victory like the others, did not fear loss like the others. He did not fight to win, he fought, because it was simply what he was. Her warriors still stood behind her, watching, waiting. She could feel their uncertainty, their shaken belief. They had never seen her hesitate, never seen her struggle, never seen her wounds before. She exhaled slowly, forcing her body to stand tall, her voice steady as she spoke. "What are you really?" she asked again, this time, not as a challenge, but as a demand. The human's gaze did not waver. He regarded her for a long moment, as if deciding whether she was ready to hear his answer. Then he spoke. "We are what happens when the universe refuses to let us exist, but we refuse to be erased." The words sent a chill down her spine, not because they were spoken with anger or hatred, but because they were spoken with absolute certainty. He took a slow step forward, then another, his movements controlled, effortless, his body healed, unbroken, his expression unreadable. "Your kind thinks you are the strongest, that no one can stand against you, that the universe itself bends to your will," he continued. "But you do not understand what it means to fight, when you have nothing left to lose, when your home is gone, when your people are hunted, when your entire species teeters on the edge of extinction, and the only choice left is to surrender or to become something that cannot be killed." Salvara's throat tightened. She had seen extinction before, had been the cause of it for countless civilizations, had watched the final moments of species who had dared to defy the Vroken Empire, had crushed their hope beneath her boot, and moved on without a second thought. But this time something felt different, because this time she was not the hunter. She was the hunted. She gritted her teeth, shaking her head, refusing to be pulled into his words. They were nothing but tricks, nothing but psychological warfare, nothing but an attempt to make her hesitate. And yet she could not deny what she had seen with her own eyes. "You are just one man," she said, her voice firm despite the weight pressing down on her. "You cannot win a war alone." He smiled, but it was not a smile of victory or smugness. It was something deeper. "Who said I was alone?" The ground trembled beneath her feet. Salvara's eyes flicked upward, past the battlefield, past the burning wreckage, past the corpses, past the broken weapons and shattered armor. And she saw them. Humans. Dozens at first, then hundreds, then thousands, emerging from the smoke, from the ruins, from the shadows. They moved like ghosts, like wraiths, bodies covered in blood, armor-dented weapons, held firm but their eyes. Their eyes burned with the same unyielding fire as the one standing before her. She had not seen them, she had not sensed them, she had thought he was alone, had believed he was an anomaly, but now she understood. He was not the exception. He was the rule. And the realization hit her like a blade to the gut. Humanity was not weak, humanity was not fragile, humanity was not prey. Humanity was inevitable. Salvara's mind raced as she took a slow step back, her instincts screaming warnings she had never felt before. Her warriors stood frozen behind her, their weapons still drawn, but their confidence shattered. The air was thick with something she could not define, something beyond fear, beyond logic, beyond reason. It was the weight of inevitability. The human in front of her did not move, did not speak, did not need to, because the truth was already written across the battlefield, written in the bodies of the fallen, written in the blood-soaked ground, written in the silent march of his kind as they emerged from the shadows. For the first time in her life, she understood what it felt like to stand on the wrong side of a war. The Vroken Empire had burned planets, had shattered fleets, had wiped entire civilizations from existence, and never once had they questioned if they would succeed, because they always had, because there had never been a force that could challenge them, not truly, not completely. Until now. Her eyes darted across the battlefield, her warriors outnumbered, outmatched, outwilled. Every human who stepped forward bore wounds that should have killed them, injuries that should have left them broken, and yet they still moved, still breathed, still fought. It made no sense. This was not strategy, this was not technology, this was not genetic engineering or advanced cybernetics. This was something else, something primal, something woven into their very existence, something the Vroken Empire had never accounted for, never even considered possible. The refusal to stay dead. Salvara exhaled, slow and steady, keeping her voice, even keeping her stance firm. Even as the weight of reality pressed down upon her. You speak of survival, she said, her tone level despite the storm raging inside her. But I see more than that in your kind. I see something deeper, something more dangerous. The human watched, her eyes unreadable. What do you see, warrior? She clenched her jaw because she did not want to say it, did not want to admit it, but the truth was undeniable. I see a force that will never stop, she said, her voice quieter than she intended. I see a species that does not fight for conquest or power or dominion. I see something worse. I see a war that never ends. The human nodded, slow, measured. You are starting to understand. Salvara inhaled deeply, weighing the weight of her next words carefully. If this continues, there will be no empire left, nothing but blood and ruin on both sides. You cannot win, but neither can we. This is a war of attrition, a war of endurance. A war of inevitability. His gaze remained steady, calm, unshaken. Then tell me, warrior, he said, his voice carrying across the battlefield, what do you choose now? Her warriors turned to her, waiting for an order, waiting for her to tell them what to do, waiting for a command that would shape the future of their people. She could order them to fight, she could unleash them upon this battlefield, she could push forward with all the strength of the Vroken Empire, and it would not matter. Because this was not a war that could be won with weapons. It was a war that had already been lost. She looked into the eyes of the human in front of her, saw no hatred, no cruelty, no arrogance, only certainty, and something else, something she could not name. Something that felt like respect. Slowly she lowered her blade. Her warriors stiffened, but did not question her, did not move, did not breathe as they waited for the next words that would decide their fate. The war is over, she said, voice steady despite the weight behind it. We are leaving. The human held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. Wise choice, warrior. She turned sharply, motioning to her forces. Without another word, they followed her, stepping back, retreating, not out of fear, not out of defeat, but because they had seen what she had seen, because they understood what she understood. This was not surrender. This was survival. As she reached the edge of the battlefield, she cast one final glance over her shoulder at the human who had changed everything. He was already turning away, stepping back into the ranks of his people, disappearing into the endless tide of unbreakable warriors. The war was over. But deep in her bones she knew. For humanity, war never truly ended.